Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we've got another video in our dry dock installment. Just as a reminder, every Wednesday we post an update on our dry dock progress. For today's video, we're talking about how often Battleship New Jersey was dry docked during her active career. While I could list off to you a couple times off the top of my head that I know that the ship went into dry dock, I'd never gone through and actually looked at how frequently is it happening. Nominally, I know it's supposed to happen every 2 years, but how often were they actually going in, and for how long were they staying in, and does that change over time? So we've been looking at the major maintenance periods New Jersey went through, and there's some stuff on this list that surprises me. So I wrote down the dates. I'm not going to do this all from memory. First of all, after being launched in December 7th, 1942, the battleship is towed into dry dock number 3, where we're looking to take her this upcoming time. Everybody knows that one. That would have been from roughly mid-December 42 to mid-January of 43. During this time, they're installing the rudders, the propellers, and doing other underwater hull work like that. The ship is commissioned in May of 1943, and she goes on to do her shakedown cruises, and then she's brought back into the yard for post-shakedown availability. So this is her second time coming into dry dock number 3. This would be from 20 September 43 up until 3 October. So they're doing some work cleaning the hull. They're installing some other stuff while she's in the shipyard. They switch up her anti-aircraft arrangements somewhat, and they correct a condenser issue that the ship had, which is probably why she was in dry dock. The 20 millimeters they could do pier side. Part of the point of shakedown cruises is to find your equipment deficiencies so that you can repair them before you actively deploy. And so it seems like they had issues with at least one of the condensers, which required an additional dry docking on the way out to join the active fleet. In this case, it may well have been because when the ship was launched, she floats straight across the Delaware River to New Jersey and grounds. The various tugboats that were there to catch her were unable to, and she went down the way significantly faster than planned, because at that time, she was the heaviest stern-first launch ship in the entire Western Hemisphere. That grounding may well have sucked mud or debris up into the condenser sea chests. She goes from there, she fights through World War II, and then in May of 45, she goes back to Puget Sound on the West Coast to get a yard period. She's there until June. So again, we're continuing the trend. Each of these yard periods tends to be about a month long. This is after more than a year of continuous combat operations, especially in warm salt water. She probably had a lot of growth fouling her hull. So this is a normal shave and a haircut. Take her in, blast all that stuff off, put a new system of coatings on her. They do some additional work with their anti-aircraft guns, radar systems, that sort of stuff in the yard at this time. They change her whole camouflage scheme from measure 21 to measure 22, and then they send her back out to the Pacific. And each of the battleships was essentially rotating through yard periods. With the 4 Iowas, there were usually only 2 or 3 active at any given time, and one was either under construction or being rotated through the yard. Her next yard period is from 11 January 1947 to 12 March 1947. So here she's had a full 2 years of post-combat operations. The ship was used very heavily during World War II. There's budgetary issues post-war, so the ship just makes do. And then about 2 years later, they finally take her in the yard to do some work. It's about a 2-month period to do that work because there was presumably a lot of deferred maintenance in this all-store peacetime environment. But interestingly, this is the last time she's dry docked before she's decommissioned in 1948. Usually, when you decommission a ship, you take it into dry dock, you blank over the sea chests, do all the mothballing, and then you put it in the reserve fleet. This post-World War II period, the reserve fleet as such is a relatively new concept, especially for these types of ships, and especially with the Iowa-class battleships and some of the cruisers and carriers that were brand new, state-of-the-art ships. The Navy isn't necessarily decommissioning them because they don't want to use them anymore. They're decommissioning them because their budget is so constrained in this post-war world. So there just wasn't time or experience to dry dock the ship prior to her being mothballed, which is useful because this is her shortest mothballing period. She's only in mothballs from 1948 to 1950 when she's reactivated for the Korean War. And so from 19 March 1950 to 6 April 1950, the ship has her bottom cleaned and she is reactivated to go out and serve in the Far East again. So interestingly, this wasn't actually part of the initial reactivation process. The ship had been mothballed in Bayonne, New Jersey. She's fully recommissioned there, and then she sails to Norfolk, which is going to be the home port for all 4 Iowa-class battleships throughout the entire 50s, even though they're operating in the Far East and they're reactivating them specifically to operate in the Far East. So she goes to this dry docking in Norfolk, gets her bottom cleaned, and then goes to the Far East to relieve Missouri. The 50s, things go pretty much according to plan, every 2 years like clockwork. So from 11 February 1952 to 16 April, and then from 23 September 1954 to 2 November, the ship goes into dry dock there in Norfolk and gets her bottom cleaned. And that seems to be the extent of the work. That final 1954 dry docking, however, she gets some strengthening to her mast, a new radar set, an SPS-8, and that may be when they install Project Katy on board. That yard period matches up remarkably well to the blueprints for modifying the ship for Project Katy. So if that happens, it probably happens then. Project Katy was the installation of nuclear 16-inch shells on the Iowa-class battleships, and because they're nuclear warheads, it required some additional modifications to their handling and stowage beyond just having all your shells on the shell deck with the squibs in the round right next to a high explosive round, right next to an armor-piercing round. And then from 19 April 1957 until 21 August 1957, the ship is in the yard to be deactivated. This is the longest deactivation period of any of the Iowas in the 50s, which is probably why in the 1960s, when they are only going to bring back 1 battleship, they look at all of them and find New Jersey to be in the best material condition. We're not entirely sure how long the ship was in dry dock at this time to get her sea chests blanked over, but during some subset of this yard period, probably for 1 or 2 months of the total, she is spending that time in dry dock. And then she doesn't even spend that long in Bayonne in the mothballs. They get rid of that mothball fleet and take her to Philadelphia. And that's where she is in August of 1967 when she's selected to be reactivated. And so she's taken back into dry dock number 3 at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. This is the 3rd time she's going into that yard. And it's not until March 18th, 1968 that the ship is reactivated. Again, we don't know the exact dates for her dry dock period during this yard period. They're basically just cleaning the bottom and undoing the work on the sea chest. And this yard period is what allows Battleship New Jersey to be the fastest battleship of all times. The work they do cleaning the bottom of the ship prior to her speed trials in March of 1968 is when she gets up to 35.2 knots. On 25 January 1969, once she is deployed to Vietnam, she's towed into the dry dock in Yokosuka. However, it seems like they just use it as a pier and they don't actually dewater the dry dock to do work on the underwater part of the hull. So depending on how you count this as a dry docking period, that seems to be the only time she goes into dry dock outside the continental US. We've got no evidence of her being in floating dry docks during World War II or going into dry dock in Yokosuka in the 50s or 60s, except for this one time when she uses it as basically a berth instead of a dry dock. She comes back from her first Vietnam deployment, and from 12 October 1969 to 20 November 1969, she goes to another yard period, likely takes place at Bremerton where she's being decommissioned. We don't believe, while Long Beach was her home port in 1968 and 1969, and she did go through some yard periods there doing topside work, we don't believe she was dry docked during that period. And so the first time she actually goes into dry dock at Long Beach Naval Shipyard, her home port of the 60s, 80s, and 90s, was from November 18th, 1981 until March 13th, 1982. And also notice how long of a yard period this is. She is in the dry dock for 4 months, which is about twice as long as any other yard period that we actually have the dates for. This is when they're doing major work to update the ship and modernize her. She's been sitting in mothballs the longest period of time that she ever had at that point, about 11 years. And so they had a lot of work to do to get the ship ready to be active again. And from this point on, she has relatively long yard periods in Long Beach for the rest of her career. And again, on that regularly normal every 2-year cycle that we'd expect. From June 18th, 1984 to November 21st, 1984, she is in the yard for her major yard period. And really, this is her post shakedown availability yard period, because the ship does her shakedown cruise off the Philippines, gets called back for an emergency in Nicaragua, and then sent to an emergency off the coast of Lebanon, all without making it back for her major yard period. And so this is a really long yard period to correct some of the work that needed additional maintenance at that time. Remember, Lehman was adamant that New Jersey goes through her yard period ahead of schedule and under budget so that he can get Congress to authorize reactivating the other 3 Iowas. So a lot of work is deferred on New Jersey, which is not deferred on the other battleships. And so they're trying to correct some of that during these other yard periods, as well as replacing a 60-inch gun barrel that had never been swapped out, that had a crack in it, so it was not able to be used off Lebanon, and do some other major work because the ship had been deployed for close to a year at that point. From February 9th, 1987 until August 29th, 1987, the ship goes through another major yard period. And this one we've got some decent documentation for, as well as the photographs recently found in our collection taken by Rusty Battleship himself, Richard Landgraf, who was in charge of the battleship program at Long Beach in the 80s. So we know that the ship had her first bounce on 25 July and her second bounce on 13 August. So we know about how long it took them to paint the bottom of the ship, bounce her, paint the bottom of the ship again. And if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say bounce, there's a whole playlist on here of our dry dock videos. One of them we talk about that sort of stuff. But essentially, the ship is sitting on keel blocks, so you can't paint that part of the ship. You have to reflood the dry dock, move the ship 4 feet, and set her down again to paint the area that was covered by those keel blocks. And to make sure that the keel blocks never line up with the sea chest, you're supposed to bounce Iowa-class battleships twice. Her final dry docking period so far takes place at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard from 23 August 1990 until 28 November 1990. That is when she is being prepared to go into the mothball fleet again to be decommissioned. She's decommissioned in February 1991 at Long Beach, towed to Bremerton, sits there until 1999 when she's towed from Bremerton through the Panama Canal for the 10th time to the Philadelphia Navy Shipyard. In 2000, when Camden is selected as the city that the ship will be home ported at as a museum, she's towed from there to Camden. In October of 2001, she's towed from an initial pier where maintenance work had been done to the pier where she sits today. And now we're hoping that in February of 2024, the ship will be towed again for the first time since October 2001 into dry dock for the first time since November 1990. It's worth pointing out that while we're currently looking at late February 2024, all sorts of stuff could change. We're looking at a 60-day yard period, which would have us in the yard for most of March and April. Coincidentally, lines up with most of our previous dry dockings. Many of these that are just shave and a haircut type affairs like we're going to do are only 60-day dry dockings. It's not till her last couple of operational dry dockings, or some of the ones revolving around mothballing and reactivating the ship, that you get longer yard periods. So some fun facts before we close out. The ship's shortest time on dry dock, her first time when they're installing the propellers. That was real quick. They just built the ship. They didn't need to do anything special. Her longest yard period, at 6 months long was, in 1987, her last period as an active warship. By this time, she is approaching 20 years in active use, which is the normal lifespan of a ship like this. And so there were some major maintenance episodes that had to take place. This is also probably the yard period when they're adding new equipment like the drone control stuff. And they're also taking measurements for an impressed current cathodic protection system due to the amount of corrosion they're seeing on these ships during this time period. While as an active warship, the Battleship was being dry docked every 2 years, as a museum ship, that's definitely overkill. And the Navy recommends closer to every 20 years between inspections and as much as 30 years between yard periods. Have you ever gotten to see a ship out of the water? Let us know in the comment section down below. Museum ships don't get to do it very frequently. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description down below to continue supporting the fundraising efforts for our upcoming dry docking period. We're getting really close to signing a contract with the yard, which is why we're starting to see what our dates are going to be. You can also support us by liking, sharing, subscribing so more people find about our channel and the museum. Thanks for watching.